Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to think about LDS history. As we get started on the Joseph Smith video presentation series, you're going to need to understand the things that are in this presentation before the other stuff is going to make sense to you. In particular, I think you're going to find yourself looking for something that doesn't exist. You're going to find yourself trying to figure some things out that actually can't be figured out, and it's going to be trouble. So to help you avoid that trouble, I decided to start off this whole process by shooting this presentation about how to think about LDS history. And you can see the subtitle there, or Why the Joseph Smith Video Series is Impossible to Do but Still Worth Doing. It'll make sense, I promise. Let's start off and just talk for a minute about what it means to study history. So history as a discipline, we assume, means you've got an orderly flow of events in a single chronological direction. Easy examples are this sort of very bare bones chronology of Joseph Smith's early life. You've got his birth in Sharon, Vermont in 1805 in December. Sometime in the spring of 1820, although we don't know when, you have the first vision, which takes place in Manchester, New York. Moroni's first visit is 3 years later. 4 years later, Joseph receives the plates, and then the Book of Mormon is published 3 years after that. Not quite 3 years, 2.5 years after that. The church is organized a month later. Okay, this is a really high-level approximation of what a history is. Now, we're skipping lots and lots of years here, but you can see the bare bones of what a history might be. And it's actually not that hard to think of all histories in just exactly this way. So, for example, if you wanted to write a super detailed history of Joseph Smith's birth as it took place in Sharon, Vermont, and by the way, if you had the documents that were necessary in order to do that, you could. And you might start with, when Lucy finds out she's pregnant. You might start with some of the conversations that Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy have during that process. You might go all the way through Lucy's pregnancy, the various things that happen or don't happen. And you might go all the way through Joseph's birth, and that might be your very sort of micro history. All of us have done this. We do this all the time. We tell a story about our lives or about something that's happened to us. Or you can do it in this chronological way that's sort of blown up to this high level like I've done here. Now, the next thing I want you to think about is, let's suppose for a minute that you were telling the history of the world and you were actually inside of an extraordinary complex simulation where everything got mapped, documented, and recorded. For those of you who've seen the movie The Matrix, you'll understand a little bit about what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, doesn't matter. Just imagine a computer program that could record the slightest movement of someone's little finger, the direction and speed of the wind, over time, the exact number of lumens of light that might reach the first eyeball and then the left, when exactly each blink took place, each movement by movement, whatever actual unit of time you talk about, you could go moment by moment. We still would not know exactly what it was like to be the subject of our history, even though there's no particular reason why we should know that, even though we have lots of data that we don't have, even though it's far more comprehensive. And by the way, someday, if you're really interested in the philosophical problems, you could even ask yourself, what would be the unit of time over which you would record such matters? You'll notice that between any two numbers, there are an infinite number of smaller numbers. And so there actually isn't an easy way to do the units. And so even the units themselves reveal that there's kind of an infinity there that you're going to miss out on. Doesn't matter for our purposes how infinity works or any of that stuff. It's just kind of interesting to think about. But I do want you to picture this matrix we're talking about, this simulation. So if we had a perfect recording of all the objective information that took place, it is of course true that we would have access to a lot more data than we have today. It is also the case that we would have a lot less data than the person who actually went through the experience. And I will say it is much more difficult than you would think to say that we actually understand the subject, the person, that is to say, who went through the experience, any better at all. Of course, we'd have more data. We're going to know a lot more about what actually happened. We're going to have seen things move. We're going to have seen each little thing that happened, each breath of air, each noise that comes to the person. So we're going to have a lot of information. There's no way they're going to remember. The problem, though, is we're going to actually have a lot less information as well, because there's a barrier of consciousness and our lack of access to the interior, what's going on the inside of the person. So even if you have more data than the person who's living through the experience, that is actually just as much of a problem for understanding the experience as it is to have less, because if you have all the information, you might assume that they have all the information, and you might reach a conclusion about what their experience was like based on information you have, but they never got because they just didn't notice the bug crawling around on the floor, and they didn't notice what the temperature was like, even though all those things were there to be noticed. And then, of course, you also have less data because you don't understand what's going on in their minds. Doctrine and Covenants section 76 is a nice example of this, actually. Many folks don't know that at the time that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon received that revelation, they were in the middle of a room surrounded by other people, none of whom could see the same vision, and they would each speak the things that they were seeing as they were seeing them. And so you could have been in the same room where Doctrine and Covenants section 76 was being received, and if Joseph and Sidney Rigdon had said nothing about what they were seeing, you would not know what it was that they were seeing. You could imagine a case where there was a magic trick going on. Someone created a really powerful illusion. Well, the subject wouldn't know that it was an illusion, but if you were living in the Matrix, you would know that it was an illusion, and so you might have a different view of what happened. So what are the 4 things that really cause a problem in our understanding? So we just talked about how objectivity, even as an ideal, doesn't actually exist, and doesn't really save us from the problems that exist with writing a true and faithful history of what happened. So I call these the 4 horsemen of the objectivity apocalypse. You can call them whatever you want to. It doesn't matter. Here they are, though. Consciousness, memory, interiority, and meaning. Consciousness, memory, interiority, and meaning. I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn. So, consciousness, the first thing you need to know when you're talking about writing history about humans is that there are limitations that are inherent in our brains and in our senses, and most of what we experience just kind of goes by the wayside. We never even know that it is there. When you are in the room, there is so much going on that would be captured by our hypothetical simulation, our matrix, but is not going to be captured by your brain. You could be sitting there in the room and, especially if you're a teenage boy, for example, your mother could be making all kinds of noises, talking to you, asking you to clean up your room, and somehow none of those makes it into your consciousness. And you don't even become aware that that is being said to you. There are lots of other things, actually. Faint smells, air occurrence, things we could see that we don't look at. That's another big one. Just our blinks, our heartbeats, anything we don't really pay a lot of attention to. The fact is, this stuff happens. It does exist. It's not fake. Just because we don't ever perceive it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I'm not suggesting that, trees don't make sound when they fall in the forest and no one's around to hear them. I'm not suggesting that. I'm only suggesting that that we just don't have access to it, even if it is a real phenomenon. Okay, so that's one problem. Memory. Now, even of those things that do temporarily come within our consciousness, most of them never make it into a meaningful memory. It's very rare, actually. If you think about all the things you see every day, how many of those things you make space in your brain to try to remember? You store and really almost can store only details that you think you're going to need to act on later. So by definition, your memories are incomplete and they are shaped by what you, at the time of the event, think will be important. How many times have you gone through something, some kind of event, and then afterwards realized, I didn't think to look for the color of that guy's shirt. I really should have thought to look at that, but I just didn't. And so I don't remember it. I didn't think it was going to be important. I didn't know it was important. I remember looking at the man's shirt. I knew at one point what color the shirt was, but I could not tell you what it is or how tall he was. Now, all of that is interesting and a problem, but it's actually not really the biggest problem with memory. The biggest problem with memory is not even that we don't store everything in memory, even though that is a problem. The biggest problem is that our memories are just not reliable. So here's what the science says. And there is a ton of science on this, and I will drop all of these references to where you can see them in the notes. But first thing I want to talk about is eyewitness studies. There's a ton of eyewitness studies, and it turns out it's very easy to manipulate the testimony that someone might give as an eyewitness and cause an eyewitness to swear to something we can prove that he or she did not see. We can cause eyewitnesses to inflate or enlarge facts or change assessments of what they saw. Here's an easy one. If you ask an eyewitness about how fast was that car going when it sped by you, they will give you a different answer than if you ask them about how fast was that car going when it passed you, or about how fast was that car going. Still, these eyewitness studies, these studies that are aimed at people who observed something and are being asked to recall what it is that they saw in a court or something like that, those are actually a lot better than even general memories are. There have been some really, really interesting studies about so-called flashbulb memories. These are people's memories of 9/11 or people's memories of the Challenger disaster. What actually happens is people's memories are not accurate. Even in the most important and memorable experiences of our lives are subject to this problem. For example, there was an enormous study. There have been several. One was about the Challenger, and the separate one was about 9/11, where people were, what they were doing, how they felt immediately after the 9/11 attack, and then at intervals thereafter, they would go back and ask the same people, actually, where were you? What did you feel? What were you doing? Now, here's an interesting thing. Just ask yourself, do you think that if I asked you what you were doing on 9/11, you would be able to tell me? I think every single one of you probably thinks that you would be able to tell me with very little, problem exactly where you were. You'll never forget it. It's burned in your mind. Here's the actual fact. Overall consistency between the three different question intervals, which were 1 year, 5 years, and then 10 years, was actually rated at 57%. 57%. That means just over 40% of the time, people were simply wrong about something. Or put better, their memory 5 or 10 years later contradicted what they had written right immediately after the fact. That's really, really interesting. And you can see, for a historian, why that might be a problem. People write down things significantly after they happen, and we treat them as though those are accurate things, and they're probably about 43% incorrect in terms of their memory, and it could be worse than that. And it's very difficult for us to tell who's who. Now, consistency in recalling the emotions that each subject experienced, that was even worse, actually. You would think, even if you couldn't remember exactly where you were, you would remember how you felt. No, actually about 37% consistency rate in describing how it is that you felt. 37%. So 63% of the time, you were straight up wrong about how you felt. Now, by no means are these memories reliable. Even when you get tested on things, general stuff about 9/11, people are getting basic details like how many airplanes are involved wrong, like 20% of the time. It's interesting that those basic details they get right more often than the things that they themselves directly experienced. Having their memory refreshed by reliable sources helped them, but still 20% of them got it wrong. Now, at a minimum, what you would love to say, this is where it gets really bad. If at a minimum, what you'd love to say is that if your memory is fuzzy or somehow not accurate of 9/11 or of the Challenger disaster, you will know it. At least you'll know that you have a fuzzy memory. However, the most surprising finding of all is actually that the survey takers' confidence in the accuracy of their memories was overwhelmingly high. On a 5-point scale, these people, this is the 9/11 study again, they rated their confidence in their memories at an average of 4.25. And in the Challenger study, they could not account for the inaccuracies in their memories when confronted with it. Subjects of the Challenger study were actually given their prior answers in their own handwriting, handed it to them, and asked to explain them in light of their current answers. And they could look at that writing, they could acknowledge that it was their handwriting, that they must have written it, agree that they wrote it, and still could not understand why they had written it because that isn't what happened. They were that sure of the accuracy of their most recent answers. Okay, so everyone's memory stinks, and there really is nothing we can do about it. Okay, interiority. Now, not everything that happens is visible or measurable in a way exterior to the consciousness or the sense of self. So think about this for a minute. Almost everything that matters in your life didn't happen externally. It happened internally on an interior level. Falling in love, I think, is an important one. Making a discovery, having an epiphany, the vision of Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, learning to understand something new about yourself or about others. All of that is something no one can really observe. Now, if you've got a perfect simulation, you just won't know it. Now, you might be able to see external evidences that you assume you know what those mean on the interior level, but you don't have access to what's actually going on in the interior level. Now, the final problem is what I think is the most important, although you could argue that memory is every bit as important. It is meaning. Now, no sensory perception or no movement of wind or sound, no act by another person actually means anything unless there is a human or at least an intelligent consciousness to give it meaning. Meaning doesn't exist and it cannot exist independent of an observer. An observer creates the meaning, him or herself. The observer does not observe the meaning, it does not see the meaning, and the meaning is not inherent in the thing. Let's just look at this illustration here to show you what I mean. So, when you see right in the middle, upper middle of that illustration, you see something that to you is quite easily recognizable as an airplane. You know that's what it is. You know what's going on. That squiggle doesn't mean airplane at all. It's just a squiggle. The only reason it means airplane is because it is referencing something you have seen many, many times. And so you are capable of looking at it and saying, that's an airplane. Now, if you had lived in a time when there was never such a thing as an airplane, you would have absolutely no idea what that squiggle meant. And you would have no way of figuring it out. There just wouldn't be any way for you to know. And you could make a million guesses, and you would never, in any of those guesses, understand what it is that you were talking about. That's not a problem of not being able to see the thing. It's a problem of assigning a meaning to something that you see and not having the context that you need to assign the proper meaning to it. The same thing goes for this little cruise ship down there on the bottom. If you'd never been alive during the era of modern cruise ships, you would have no idea what that was. Now, you might be able, through some context clues, to figure out that it was a boat. It's possible. There's a little squiggle there that maybe that's at the bottom, then maybe that's a sea, and maybe you would be able to figure that out. I'm actually not certain, but my point is, it would not be obvious to you, and there could be any number of other meanings assigned to that symbol. The same thing goes for any of the symbols there. We're sort of used to picturing humans with these circular heads. We know what the praying hands look like. We know what a tree looks like. We have an idea what a sun looks like. That squiggle right above the sun looks like a bird to us because we're familiar with birds being portrayed in that way. But anyway, the point is, if you didn't have any of that context, you would not be able to assign the proper meaning to it. I'll, at the risk of nailing this point home too hard, Jerry Seinfeld has a great little bit he says where he's talking about, I see these people walking their dogs and they're following along and they're picking up their poop. And to me, this is just the lowest function of human life. I think if aliens are watching this through telescopes, they're going to think that the dogs are the leaders. Because if you saw two life forms, one of them is making a poop and the other one's picking it up and carrying it around for him, who would you assume is in charge? The point is, this whole aliens from another planet would look at this differently trope is based on the fact that it takes context to know what things mean. And if you don't have the context, or if you have the wrong context, then the meaning of any observation will be either elusive or just plain wrong. This problem, more than any other, and this is why I say it's the most important problem, is what causes people to misunderstand religious people and their behavior, in particular historical religious figures. Religious practice lives in a world that is defined by doctrine, by mythology, by tradition, by scripture, by revelation, and the behavior of devoutly religious people is hard to understand unless you understand how it feels to believe in religious things. The meaning that a religious person assigns to an event is often very, very different from the meaning assigned by someone who does not have that religious understanding or level of devotion. So there's a lot of supposedly scientific, objective, or naturalist approaches to the world. And those exist and they're fine. But when they look at a religious person, honestly, it's a little bit like an alien from another planet. It's not quite as bad as that, but it's much worse than people assume that it is. Because each religion has its own unique assumptions, and it reasons to its own conclusions based on those assumptions. It has an internal logic. It has its own way to make meaning, and there's no reason why an outsider can't learn these things, but in many ways it will never quite make sense to them the way that it does to a believer. Now, there's a temptation that we're always going to have, which is to ignore the internal logic of a religious subject, somebody who's a subject of a history, and impose upon him or her meanings that will make sense to the writer or to the audience rather than the ones that actually motivated them. This problem exists for the believer and the non-believer, but if the subject is a believer and the historian is a non-believer, it can progress from just a temptation to sort of impose your own views to a certainty. Because the religious modes of making meaning don't even sometimes occur to a non-believer as possibilities in the first place. Some things that seem entirely obvious to a religious believer just don't make sense if you're not religious. So there's a problem here, which is that religious ways of making meaning are so different from the ones that most of us use in our daily lives that in many ways writing a religious history is almost like translation. It has to be written by someone thoroughly familiar with the religion and its ways of making meaning. That person does not have to be a native speaker of the religious dialect, but it's going to be a lot easier for a native speaker to translate it for a secular audience than the other way around. Now, why do I say that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Religious people live their lives in a secular world. All of us do, and they are constantly called upon to operate within the logic of a secular world. Well, the same is not true of secular scholars in religious environments. Unless you have genuinely tried, for example, to make sense of prayers that seem to have gone unanswered, or to pray for a miracle, or to receive an assurance of forgiveness of sins, among many other experiences that could be cited that are unique to Christian believers, it is pretty much impossible to know what that experience is like, or what meanings a believer would take from similar experiences. So, that's why meaning is such a big problem. So, let's go to the next slide. So what? Well, so writing or understanding history accurately is extraordinarily difficult, and we will never know whether we have it right on even a basic level, much less on the details. And by the way, it even gets worse from here, but let's just start with this example of consciousness, memory, interiority, and meaning. So God makes a statement in the scriptures. Consciousness. What is God looking at when he's making that statement? What is the memory that is focused? Now, the only thing about God is we assume he's perfect, and so we assume that all these things are always accurate. But the interesting thing about it is God often speaks to us in our own language and in our own way so that we can understand. And so you can get a statement that is nominally from God, but it could be subject to all of these four problems that we're talking about here. Now, God might be talking to Joseph Smith. Now, you don't know, and I don't know, what of God's statements came within Joseph's consciousness. We do not know whether he forgot some of what he was told. We have no way of knowing that. We don't know what is happening on an interior level. We can only know what is happening on an exterior level. Someone wrote it down. Did Joseph receive more information on an interior level than ever got written down, and we just don't know about it? And then finally, what is the meaning of what Joseph is told? You know, we learn things, we hear God say something, and our meaning that we take from it might be quite different than the meaning Joseph took from it, or that, let's say, God meant for Joseph to take from it. Now, the other thing to remember when we're talking about Joseph Smith is you actually don't have access to very many things that Joseph Smith himself wrote. Instead, what you have is a series of writings of other people who saw him or observed him do things or say things and then wrote them down. So we don't know what we don't know when it comes to them either. So we don't know what made it into their consciousness and what it is that they just never observed. We don't know what things that at one point they observed and they just didn't remember them to write them down. We don't know what's going on the interior of Joseph Smith because they don't. And we don't know what's going on the interior of them. Not unless they tell us. And then that may or may not be reliable. And then they're making meaning out of something that Joseph Smith supposedly said or did. If we were there and observing Joseph, would we make the same meaning of what he said? Would we gather the same thing that they gathered? There is absolutely no way to know that. And if you've followed eyewitness statements, sometimes you will see a person who swears up and down that someone is acting in a quote-unquote suspicious way. And someone else who swears up and down, oh no, I didn't see anything that looked suspicious to me. It just looked like they were being cautious. Okay? In Joseph Smith's case, someone wrote it down and they said he was sneaking around suspiciously. And because we don't know, we weren't there to observe it, we have no way to know if that's an accurate description or not. It's just the meaning somebody gave to something he did. Finally, you have the writer and the reader. So the person who's writing the history is now looking at what the original observer did, trying to understand what was said, make meaning out of it, may or may not have had a conscious understanding of all of the possible observations. So maybe there's more sources that the writer or reader is not aware about, and so they could not have come into their consciousness. There could be a memory problem. They could have just forgotten about one or more sources. And then there's something going on in their interior that they may not be saying that's there that actually affects what kind of meaning they assign to what Joseph is supposed to have done according to an original observer. So you can see how when you layer these things on top of each other, it gets really, really, really tricky. So I'm going to do a couple of examples. In 1843, Levi Richards was in Nauvoo. He heard Joseph Smith give a talk, and in the talk, Joseph made a reference to the first vision in an address near the Nauvoo temple site. Here is what Levi Richards says. At 6 a.m., I heard Elder George J. Adams upon the Book of Mormon. He proved from the 24th, 28th, and 29th of Isaiah that the everlasting covenant set forth, which was set upon by Christ and the apostles, had been broken. Then, he says, President J. Smith bore testimony to the same, saying that when he was a youth, he began to think about these things, but could not find out which of all the sects were right. He went into the grove and inquired of the Lord which of all the sects were right. He received for answer that none of them were right, that they were all wrong, and that the everlasting covenant was broken. He said he understood the fullness of the gospel from the beginning to the end, and could teach it, and also the order of the priesthood in all its ramifications. Earth and hell had deposed him and tried to destroy him, but they had not done it, and they never would. Now, this is an interesting account. It seems to have been recorded very close in time to when it was observed. We don't actually know that, but that's what it seems to have happened. Relatively soon, probably that night. It is recognizably referring to the first vision. That's what Joseph Smith is clearly describing, but it doesn't mention anything about Joseph having seen God the Father or his son Jesus Christ in response to his prayer. It just records some information that we learn in other accounts of the first vision he was told by them on that occasion. Now, is this story in contradiction to the other accounts of the first vision because it fails to mention what most of us today take to be the most important part? Well, Richards likely recorded what he heard and or remembered at the time, but it is hard to know with how much accuracy. It's possible that he was not conscious. So, the first of the four horsemen of certain statements made by Joseph during the meeting. Maybe he couldn't hear very well, or his attention drifted for a moment. So maybe Joseph mentioned those things, and Levi Richards just didn't hear him say it. It's also possible, since this appears to have been a diary entry and not immediately contemporaneous, that he heard the prophet Joseph mention the visit of the Father and the Son, but by the time he recorded the prophet's words, his memory had just failed, and he'd forgotten this detail. Now, there's no way to know what Levi or Joseph were thinking on a strictly interior level of the visit of the Father and the Son on that occasion. It had been described many times in public prior to 1843, but for reasons of emphasis. Now remember, the discussion here was actually about the breaking of the everlasting covenant by faithless people following the ministry of Christ and the apostles. It's entirely possible that the specific identity of the personages who delivered the message was not that important in the context of Joseph's sermon, and so on an interior level, he just decided to leave that out and just talk about the message itself. Now, that's something that Richards would not know. He would have no idea about whether or not Joseph Smith had done it for that reason, had left it out for a reason. Joseph, of course, we don't know what Richards knew or what Richards was leaving out. It's not clear that whether he knew about that vision, but he just left it out because he knew the story very well, and in the interest of conserving space and energy, he just didn't bother to include that detail. Now, finally, the meaning of this statement in context seems to have little or nothing to do with the presence or absence of the Father and the Son. Joseph is using the incident to illustrate a specific doctrinal point, which is the everlasting covenant had been broken, as explained in the relevant chapters of Isaiah prior to his reception of the first vision. This is actually an interesting detail. It's specific, and it's not mentioned in the other first vision accounts, although it is consistent with them. Now, why does it matter that Levi Richards didn't record Joseph having said anything about the Father and the Son. Well, it's not important to Joseph or to Levi Richards. It's only important to modern scholars, and especially, it must be noted, anti-Mormons, to claim that Joseph Smith's accounts of the first vision are, quote, not consistent and reflect some kind of growth or change based on the ongoing needs of his purported deception of the world, and more especially of his followers. Now, with all due respect, I just can't imagine a discussion that's less interesting to a person who actually wants to learn about Joseph Smith. My focus here is understanding Joseph as he and his followers would have understood him, and it is not in proactively making a case that he was committing fraud or refuting that possibility by imposing my own speculation on the text. To me, the more interesting question here is, what did Joseph mean when he said that the covenant in Isaiah had been broken? Is that notion consistent with other versions of the first vision? How so? What does it teach us about how Joseph saw himself and the project of the LDS Church? So now you can see how all of those problems crop up. I'm going to do two more very brief examples. One of them is one that I wrote, and I just want you to just pay attention, and I will give you some of the background of it. It's going to sound super smooth, and you're going to say, oh, I know what's going on here, and then I'll tell you the details. So sometime in the latter part of the winter of 1831, a company of 7 or 8 people traveled 40 miles from Hiram, Ohio to Kirtland, Ohio, to meet Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. This company included Methodist minister Ezra Booth and his wife Dorcas, John and Elsa Johnson, Simons and Mahatable Ryder, and a doctor from Windham with the last name Wright. Now possibly it may have included also the doctor's spouse. John and Elsa's son Lyman had been baptized a Mormon by Sidney Rigdon in February of 1831, and Booth was the Johnsons' Methodist minister, and he had sometime thereafter obtained a copy of the Book of Mormon and brought it to the Johnsons' house. There the little group sat up all night reading the book and were very much exercised over it. John and Elsa had become convinced of the Book of Mormon, but the main purpose for coming to see Joseph Smith was actually not that. It was Elsa wanted Joseph to heal her nearly useless right arm. The Johnsons' business was running a dairy and making cheese. This work required the help of everyone in the family, including Elsa. Her inability to participate hampered the family economically, and her injury had by this time caused her serious pain for nearly 3 years. Now Elsa approached Joseph and requested him to heal her. Joseph asked her if she believed the Lord was able to make him an instrument in healing her arm. She said she believed that the Lord was able to heal her arm. So they met. They met Joseph in Newell K. Whitney's home in Kirtland. Simons Ryder, who was a Campbellite, not a Methodist like the others, he pressed Joseph. Campbellites at the time did not have a belief in miracles, asking him if it was true that he pretended to the performance of miracles. Now, at Ryder's 1870 funeral, the speaker recounted the story, stating, "Someone said, 'Here is Mrs. Johnson with a lame arm. Has God given any power to men now on the earth to cure her?'" Now, according to Ryder's eulogist, a few moments later when the conversation had turned in another direction, Joseph Smith rose and, walking across the room, took Mrs. Johnson by the hand and said in a most solemn and impressive manner, "Woman, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command thee to be whole," after which he immediately left the room. According to Philo Dibble, Joseph took her by the hand, prayed in silence a moment, pronounced her arm whole in the name of Jesus Christ, and turned and left the room. Ryder's eulogist says that the company were awestruck at the presumption of the man and the calm assurance with which he spoke. The sudden mental and moral shock, I know not how better to explain this well-attested fact, electrified the rheumatic arm. Mrs. Johnson at once lifted it up with ease, and on her return home the next day she was able to do her washing without difficulty or pain. Immediately after Joseph walked out, Ezra Booth asked Elsa if her arm was whole, and she straightened it out and replied, "It is as good as the other." When asked if it would remain whole, Joseph Smith answered and said, "It is as good as the other and liable to accident as the other." So, there are 3 sources I'm using to write this story. One of them is the account of Philo Dibble. Now, Philo Dibble was living in Kirtland at the time. He had every reason to sort of know. He probably heard the story from Simon's writer or from Ezra Booth or from both of them. It was not something that was kept secret. But it's not a first-hand account. I don't know what Philo Dibble knew or didn't know when he wrote his account. I don't know who his source was. I don't know what it is that he saw that convinced him that his source was telling the truth. Now, another source I'm using is a late autobiography that was actually written by John and Elsa Johnson's daughter about what happened when they got the Book of Mormon, and that they stayed up all night reading it, and they were very much exercised over that. That's interesting, but I don't even know if John and Elsa's daughter was there. All I know is John and Elsa's daughter wrote this down. She seems to be somebody who would likely know, and I have no reason to think it isn't true, if that makes sense. Now, the last one is this man who wrote a eulogy for Simon's writers. Now, Simon's writer died in 1870, and in 1870, this man gave the eulogy at his funeral. Okay, what's interesting about it is he spent some time trying to explain, this is the context, why Simon's writer had at one time abandoned the faith. And so he was telling the story of how Joseph Smith performed this miracle, and that was the reason why Ryder had left and joined the Mormons for a while. Okay, all of that seems fine, and I am sure that Ryder's eulogist heard it from Simon's writer himself. But when I say I'm sure, do I know that? Do I know what was said? Do I know whether the story was made more dramatic? Do I know whether Simon's writer's eulogist maybe just didn't hear the story from Philo Dibble? I don't. I don't know any of that stuff. I have no idea whether he remembered it right. I have no idea what things he didn't ever notice about the story but should have. I don't know what was going on in anybody's mind or heart except for as they may have told someone who told someone who told someone. And in the end, the meaning that they assigned to it, I know only because that's what somebody else said was the meaning that they assigned to it. So, in the end, what happens is all of these folks join the church. And then what happens is they leave. And then what happens is Ezra Booth decides somewhere along the line that the LDS Church is not true. That if God is a God of consistency, then he can't be the proper God of Mormonism. Simon's writer was upset, among other things, because his name was misspelled in a revelation. Now, Booth at one point even goes on to write a criticism saying, many Mormons profess to be endowed with the same power as the ancient apostles were, but they have been hitherto unsuccessful in finding the lame, the halt, and the blind, who had faith sufficient to become the subjects of their miracles. And it is now concluded that this work must be postponed until they get to the Missouri, for the Lord will not show these signs unto this wicked and adulterous generation. Well, that's an interesting thing for Ezra Booth to say, because if anybody knows that that is not true, it's Ezra Booth. Ezra Booth was there, in the room. He watched Elsa Johnson be healed. What made him change his mind? Well, he assigned a different meaning to whatever it is that he saw later on. Now, he could have gone the other way. He could have decided that he was going to hold to his belief, even though he saw some things that he didn't like that Joseph did later. But he didn't do that. So, these are some illustrations of these problems. All right, now, let's just get to the last real problem, and we're almost finished with this presentation. Now, as if this weren't enough, let's talk for a minute about documents. It turns out documents are the only way for us to gain access to the past, and all of these documents suffer from the same problems we've discussed: consciousness, memory, interiority, and meaning. And this is the worst part. This makes it much, much, much worse. There is no particular reason to believe that the documents that do happen to have survived, that are available to us, are meaningfully representative of the documents that once existed. much less of the events that actually occurred. So there's no rhyme nor reason about who wrote down documents, what they wrote, and whether those people who wrote were accurate. If we had the simulation that we've been talking about, if we had the matrix, we would at least be able to see if the documents we have are describing the right stuff, if there's stuff they left out that matters. We would at least have that. We don't even have that. So if you're digging, if you just use this as an analogy to physical archaeology, it can kind of help you a little bit. So just imagine you're digging in a well-preserved trash heap. You can come to a very different conclusion about the type of people you're learning about than you would if you were digging in a temple. The things that you would find in one would be very different from one another. And this one would have stuff people used in everyday life and then disposed of, and the other would have, or at least represent, things they thought to be of eternal importance. Now, in archaeology, your biggest advantage is that you can often tell which place you're digging in by the structure of the other buildings, the types of things you've typically found in similar places, and other context clues. But with documents, you often know much less or even nothing about where you are proverbially digging. You really don't know why in any specific way someone is writing a document. You have some idea, but you don't know who it is and is not a reliable witness, what their motive was, and there are certainly clues. But the choice of whom to believe, in many cases, is just straight up arbitrary. In archaeology, you don't have the problem of not knowing what else you would find if you look next door to the place you're looking today. If you want to know, you just dig. You may find nothing, but finding nothing will tell you useful information. With document digs, the lack of adjacent documentation could simply be that no one at the time thought the incident was important enough to record other than the one source that you have, or that they did think it was important enough to record, but they were just too busy or lazy to do so. They could have actually done the recording, and that might have been destroyed, or they might have done the recording and it might exist, but you just haven't found it yet because you don't know exactly where to dig. It is a thoroughly frustrating and incredibly time-consuming process. Any serious historian can tell you it is a struggle. So is there a solution? Not really, actually. You can't access the consciousness, interior space, memories, or meaning-making of historical figures, or even your own, actually. Not very well. And so by the time you try to filter through what you think are your own problems with that, plus the historian, then those of the author of any original source document, then those of the source the author of the document was relying on, and then finally on, say, Joseph Smith, sorting out the details gets pretty close to impossible. So in some sense, when I write a smooth narrative history, it is always a lie. It is always an obfuscation. It feels natural. It feels straightforward when written well, but the smoothness of the narrative always conceals as much or more than it reveals. The choice of what to leave in and what to leave out is actually where all the action happens, and unless the reader is already a specialist in the area, whatever is left in will be given attention, and whatever is left out will remain totally unknown. And if you don't address that problem, and you don't think about that problem, you can come to conclusions that are completely and totally wrong. In many ways, history, smooth narrative history, can be like a court case in which only one side presents its story. And the advocate presenting that side gets to make and decide all the evidentiary objections. So anything that's not helpful to the case of the advocate or author gets left out entirely, and the jury never sees it. So there is some unknown number of facts. They do exist, but I don't know how many there are, as to which no record exists. And if we understood those facts, they might change our point of view about the historical record regarding Joseph Smith in a really, truly meaningful way. I don't know how many, we don't know how many, we don't know what they are, and we don't know what they would change. But we do know they exist. Well, how do we know that they exist? Because it's pretty much impossible for them not to exist. In Joseph Smith's lifetime, there were something like 225,000 waking hours. We maybe have general accounts of a couple thousand hours in total, depending on how you count. And we have specific accounts of far fewer than that. So there's just way too many things left unaccounted for or unremarked upon. So it's really pretty much certain that some key important piece of evidence is missing just because no one documented it, or documents that once existed have not survived or can't be found. It's just really impossible. So you always have a provisional picture, and it's always going to be incomplete, and there's going to be gap filling required to understand even basic facts, much less motives. So tell me again, why are you making this video series? If you think it's so impossible to do LDS history, well, why would you bother? Why try? Well, the reason is because I've, over the years, come to understand that if nobody like me makes a contribution, then the reason that the contribution remains unmade will not matter. Everyone will assume that other people who are talking have the final word, and the field will be ceded to those who have bad intentions or who are not well informed enough to understand the unavoidable problems that all historians face, their own biases, or the inescapability of those things. So would we rather have only blind guides that do not realize the limits of their own vision, or is it better to have at least one guide that understands those limits, is upfront about them, and still tries to make a good faith effort to understand Joseph as he would have understood himself? So I'm going to spend just a second here to talk about the sort of three main veins in which LDS history gets written. The first one is pretty straightforward. It is suspicious or skeptical history. This type of history looks at Joseph Smith, and it doesn't ask how Joseph felt or how he made sense of his life, but rather whether there is any chance or theory under which his prophetic claims, and primarily this means any supernatural or spiritual experiences, might be false, and his life might still make sense. So really the goal is, how do I make sense of Joseph Smith's life, just assuming that none of the stuff that he said happened. That is probably 90 to 95% of the history of Joseph Smith that has ever been written or ever will be written is of that variety. The founding assumptions are that Joseph was a false prophet, either because there one is just no such thing as a true prophet. So that's the supposedly objective historical approach. Or there is such a thing, but Joseph was not one of them. The second one is usually an anti-Mormon approach. Not always, but it comes from prior religious or ideological commitments by the author. The first one is someone who typically thinks of themselves as a quote-unquote serious historian, but has already started the process by ruling certain things out. So these approaches may characterize themselves as being fully willing to accept Joseph's prophetic gifts in theory, but merely requiring extraordinary evidence to accept such extraordinary claims. Well, ironically, this is exactly what it means to have a bias. Certain claims are harder to prove in your mind than others. Nor is it clear what precisely would qualify as the necessary extraordinary evidence, since when I read these histories, at no point can I see any of these writers actually find the standard to have been met, which is a pretty telling detail. The self-understandings of the two groups are quite different, but in the end, the works they produce are rather more similar than anything else. In the case of the objectivist historians, this methodology is justified because their founding assumptions mean it makes no sense to look at extraordinary or supernatural explanations to make sense of any event, if an environmental or naturalist interpretation will possibly do. In the case of religious or ideological historians who dislike Joseph for other reasons, the methodology is justified because Joseph's story, as he tells it, threatens something that they think is more important, such as another religious belief or a political project. So, in the end, the way they test Joseph's prophetic claims is to see if there's any other possible explanation. If one exists, then they reject those claims even if they don't say so. The rejection actually comes from the fact that the historian simply writes an account which attributes known historical facts to whatever the historian's preferred explanations are, typically cultural or environment, rather than to the explanations Joseph and his followers would have recognized. They present this as objective because it doesn't involve supernaturalism or similar beliefs. It is the view that the historian associates with some idealized rational being who rejects the idea of genuine manifestations from the beyond. Now, if you press somebody, they might claim they don't reject them, but they just prefer other explanations. But it's still a preference, and it doesn't make these accounts of history more accurate or more scientific. It just certainly doesn't result in a historical account that actually explains what Joseph and his followers thought they were doing. in terms that they would understand and recognize as applying to them. For historians of type 2, their approach winds up being the same, but in many ways their self-conception is quite different. They're committed to some other ideological or religious positions, and they just are trying to debunk Joseph Smith. So in the end, it winds up being the same stuff. So I'm not saying that this history is dishonest. I don't really think that's right. I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it's dishonest for people to write histories seeking to put forth whatever narrative they think, quote unquote, really happened, even if others disagree with that. And I don't think everybody who writes like this is just an advocate for a particular point of view all the time, although some certainly are. All I am saying is that historians bring to their task certain sets of biases, preferences, beliefs, and preconditions, including the belief that miracles do not happen, prophets do not exist, or Joseph Smith was not a prophet. And those show up in the narratives that they create to explain historical phenomena, even if they never talk about it. Now, number 2 is backward projection. This is the sort of history I think a lot of folks who write what they call objectivist history are reacting against, or they think they're reacting against. This is sort of looks at the prophet and ignores anything that seems different from the experience or understanding of the person writing the history. To some extent, it's kind of similar to suspicious or skeptical histories, but because all you're doing is just taking what you think and you experience and projecting it backwards. But in the end, what happens here is that Joseph's history and all the documents are put in this kind of, if you remember your story, the bed of Procrustes, the items that don't fit, they just cut them from the narrative. And any item that can somehow fit, however implausibly, into a narrative that they've already started with, they just stretch that out so that it does fit. There's not really a surprise or a new insight. So I don't love that. I don't necessarily think that scholarship is lazy or dishonest. I think writers, many of them, have done a lot of research. But it could also, but at least at a minimum, it is well informed in terms of the documents exist, but simply blind to the interpretive possibilities beyond the sort of ones that they are focused on. Now, finally, you got type 3, which is evolutionary history. This kind of history works backward, not to project the specific beliefs of an author or the church onto Joseph Smith and his contemporaries, but just to trace the evolution of the beliefs of the modern church by examining the beliefs and practices of Joseph Smith and the early Latter-day Saints. The main assumption here is that the practices and beliefs of Joseph Smith were somehow intended, designed, or destined inevitably to result in the practices and beliefs of one or more of the modern LDS churches. So Joseph's own religious approach or beliefs is not really all that important. It's not necessarily a complete expression of his religious truths. It's just the modern church beliefs as they exist are assumed to be the correct ones and the result of evolutionary processes. So the interesting question is thus how Joseph Smith's beliefs evolved over time or foreshadowed the beliefs of the modern church. I wouldn't say this is wrong. It's just interesting as it is, but it's not necessarily giving you as much insight into what Joseph actually thought as you might think. It's much more a history of modern churches than it is a history of Joseph himself. So pretty much everybody concedes that Joseph's beliefs and teachings and writings are not identical to those of later church leaders or believers. And so they shouldn't be seen just or necessarily or primarily interesting as a kind of proto-Mormonism compared to the fully developed LDS churches of today. I'm more interested in what they actually were. So, cards on the table, here are my biases, and here's why. My perspective on Joseph is that he is best understood as a believer. By this I mean that he worked out and understood his life in the context of the revelations he received and his understanding of the scriptures and the doctrines of God. These constituted, as he put it many times, a covenant relationship between him and God and the promises of the Lord to him. There may well be various kinds of environmental, naturalist, or similar explanations that might be stretched to fit his behavior. But the explanations that he gave himself, the ones that seem to have mattered to Joseph Smith, were spiritual and revelatory. This, I think, is actually really obvious if you just look at what he said and you take it at face value. It's only when you start approaching the historical record with cynicism, suspicion, skepticism, or the desire to sort of connect Joseph into the future that the other possibilities appear. All of his correspondence, his revelations, and his teachings show that he saw himself pretty much exclusively as God's messenger. There is no record that anything else other than his spiritual mission really mattered much to him. Even his family, which was the only other thing one could say was crucially important to his identity, was incorporated into and thus became a part of his spiritual journey. Okay, now I've told you what I'm doing here. I look at Joseph and I don't see anybody other than a believer who is trying his best to do what God is asking him to do. Not succeeding all the time, actually. Not even necessarily right all the time about what it is that he's being asked to do. Now, what I see, and the reason for the title here, is that the crowning project of Joseph's life, the reason of his ministry as he understood it from the beginning, was to build Zion, the New Jerusalem, on this, the American continent. That was the reason why he did every single thing he did. And all of the things that you read in the history, if you pay attention, that is the thread that runs through all of it, beginning in 1830 in Palmyra. Now, in the end, my narrative is not better. I think it's better because I happen to have these particular beliefs that make it seem better to me. But it is different, and it is hopefully more self-aware. I know that my own experiences as a believer trying to walk the straight and narrow path like Joseph, they shape my perspective, and it's silly to pretend otherwise. But I happen to think that my perspective is far closer to Joseph's own than, say, Fawn Brodie or Gerald and Sandra Tanner, Michael Quinn, or even Richard Bushman, who was a very sympathetic objectivist. What I'm trying to do is capture as best as possible what Joseph himself did, said, and thought. Thanks to the many other researchers and writers who've compiled the sources over the years, it is easier than it used to be, notwithstanding all the problems we're talking about now. It's much easier now than it used to be to know at least some of the things that Joseph is supposed to have said and done. It is in the realms of thought and feeling that I think I can make a contribution that can really only be made by a believer who has what I think is a fairly deep and complicated understanding of the teachings of Latter-day Saint scriptures. I really think it does take this kind of special knowledge that you have to earn through not just reading those scriptures, but living as a believer yourself to understand Joseph Smith. So with that, I hope that you are sort of understand where I'm coming from and are prepared to kind of sit back and understand the problems inherent in what we're trying to do, but still absorb what we're learning about Joseph Smith in this Joseph Smith video series. Thanks a lot. See you next time.